Thanks so much for having me today. So my name is Nicola Wheeler. I'm Policy and Programme Lead in Climate Change and Sustainability at Richmond and Wandsworth Councils. For those that don't know, Richmond and Wandsworth Councils are two separate councils, but we have sort of a shared staffing arrangement. So I work across both of the boroughs. So I'm going to talk to you today about our new adaptation resilience strategy. This is something I've been working on for the past sort of 9 months, and we're taking to committee early next year. So we recognised that we had made good progress in mitigation and we had quite clear targets of what we wanted to achieve. And while we had done some work around adaptation resilience, we had less of a kind of clear strategy and sort of focus and framework as to what that work really looked like. So we decided to produce this adaptation resilience strategy. We have one for Richmond and one for Wandsworth, although they use the same sort of framing. So the aim of this strategy was to present the climate risk and vulnerability assessments that we conducted for both boroughs. And then secondly, to provide a clear adaptation and resilience framework that would be used by all council teams. And that was to ensure that we had a robust and consistent approach to this work. And third, we wanted to set long-term priorities to guide and inform our work on adaptation resilience. And then finally, to use this as an opportunity to inform local stakeholders of climate risk in the borough and also the role of the council in addressing these risks and potentially to help identify other opportunities for collaboration. So I'm going to go through some of the work we did for our climate risk and vulnerability assessment. This had 3 key elements, the first of which was risk baselining. So we present observational data on what our current climate is like in Richmond and Wandsworth. And also we use observational data on how the climate has changed since sort of the late 19th century. We also present a series of climate projections. So this is looking at sort of possible scenarios of how the climate might be expected to change in the future. And for this, we include existing risks such as sort of heat waves and flooding, but also emerging risks such as sea level rise and infectious and vector-borne disease. And then finally, we conducted a vulnerability assessment, and this was informed by 2 workshops that we held with internal officers. And then also officers completed a survey, which was used to help inform that vulnerability assessment. So I'm not going to go into these in too much detail. This is really just to give a bit of a flavour as to what the climate risk and vulnerability assessment look like. So we have here an image from our climate risk map. So we've produced this for both Richmond and Wandsworth. What you can see here is the borough of Wandsworth, and this shows overall sort of climate risk. So we took risk of overheating, risk of flooding, and also air pollution, and we compiled that with a series of social vulnerability factors that might exacerbate exposures to those risks to give this kind of indication of what overall risk looks like across the borough. And we broke that down at the LSOA level. And then you can see the same here for Richmond. So it really identifies kind of where priority areas of action are. And in terms of the observational data, as I mentioned, this goes back to sort of the late 19th century. So we can see here, this is for Wandsworth, how mean annual air temperature has changed since 1890 up to 2022. And there's a clear increasing trend there. We also looked at precipitation. While sort of annual average precipitation hasn't really changed that much, there's quite clear sort of seasonal changes. So for summer rainfall, we can see a clear decrease in trend over that same time period. And then for winter, we can see an increasing trend. So the other component of the sort of the climate risk assessment was looking at projections of how our climate might change in the future. So there are a number of different sort of variables that we looked at. This is an example here showing mean annual air temperature. So you can see, I'll just go through very briefly just for those that may not be too familiar, but there are 4 different scenarios here. They essentially each represent a different emission scenario. So the green line is we take really sort of ambitious action in mitigating greenhouse gas emissions globally, and the red line represents sort of business as usual. We really don't we're not successful sort of global mitigation efforts. So you can see there's really significant differences across those scenarios to how temperature might change in future up to 2100. And then we looked at sort of future projections of precipitation as well, and we focused on kind of the seasonal changes. As we saw with the observational data, there was this already observed trend of decreasing summer precipitation, which can be seen that will become much more severe in future, even under sort of a best case scenario. And then similarly for winter precipitation, we can see potentially massive increases in rainfall to be expected in the winter months. And then we also looked at sea level rise. So this is projections of how in London sea level rise might be expected to change. And I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but I mentioned we undertook a survey with officers to help inform our vulnerability assessment. We essentially asked officers for each of these services on the left there, what the impact of these climate hazards that are listed across the top, what the impact of each of those hazards on that service would be expected to be, and also what the likelihood of each of those hazards occurring was expected to be. And then we multiplied those sort of averages to give an indication of what the vulnerability of each of those sectors was to different climate hazards. What came out really clearly was that extreme heat and flooding was consistently highlighted as a really high all sectors had a really high vulnerability to those hazards. So the other element that we developed as part of this strategy was an adaptation resilience framework. In a sense, this is kind of the most important element because this really shapes how we're actually going to approach adaptation and resilience work going forward. So as I mentioned before, this is to ensure that we have a robust and consistent approach across the entire organisation, not just within the climate change and sustainability team. But we also didn't want to do this work in silo. So the framework builds on work that has already been done regionally to ensure that we're being consistent with work happening in London and beyond. And two sort of key elements really inform this. The first was the London Climate Resilience Review, which identified 5 principles that should guide adaptation work. And then the second was aligning with the Environment Agency's Thames Estuary 2100 plan, which adopts an adaptive pathways approach. So just briefly, for those that don't know, the London Climate Resilience Review recommended that these 5 principles should guide work on climate adaptation and resilience. The first of which is that adaptation must take a people-centred approach, be locally led, strive to reduce vulnerability and address socio-economic and racial inequality. Secondly, that adaptation must be embedded across decision-making and organisations, ensuring that measures are owned at the strategic level and responsibility is assigned. Thirdly, that adaptation must be integrated with work to meet net zero to ensure a consistent, coherent approach, and that is not being done in silo. And then fourth, that adaptive pathways approaches are adopted to account for uncertainties and to embed flexibility into any adaptation work. And then finally, that nature-based solutions are considered and prioritised. So as part of the framework, we've identified 3 key components which sort of take the recommendations of the London Climate Resilience Review and also the TEE 2100 plan. So the first which is around climate risk and vulnerability assessments. So our proposal is that all projects will need to do a high-level climate risk and vulnerability assessment at the planning stage, and we will be creating a tool for all council teams to use. The second is around monitoring and evaluation. So as I mentioned, we're adopting an adaptive pathways approach. So really key to that is understanding how projects that have been implemented are actually holding up in terms of how the climate is changing. So we'll be reviewing our projects every 5 years to really embed that flexibility and make adjustments to work as needed. And then finally, a council-wide approach. So there'll be a number of steps in kind of ensuring that our framework is adopted across the council. The first of which is establishing an adaptation and resilience board, which will sort of monitor work in this area. And then finally, we identified 5 priorities. So these are sort of complementary, and they are also show a sort of phased approach to adaptation and resilience work. And importantly, each priority is necessary in order for them all to be successful. So the first priority is that we embed adaptation and resilience across the organisation. The second is that we ensure a joined-up approach to adaptation and resilience to maximise the impact of the work done and increase the capacity of the council to build a more resilient borough. Third is to compile and analyse the data required to effectively adapt to climate change and increase resilience. And then fourth, to implement effective adaptation and resilience measures across the borough. And then finally, to ensure that formal monitoring and evaluation is in place. Now, these are long-term, they're aspirational, but they're designed to inform and guide our work on adaptation and resilience. And also importantly, these will be supported and complemented by our annual climate action plans. So this is something that we publish every year to ensure that we are continually updating and increasing our ambition on work on climate change. But these priorities will be used to sort of guide what those actions look like each year and to ensure we're on track. And then finally, I'm just going to finish on kind of a few reflections on my experience of writing this strategy, which I hope will be helpful for anyone kind of looking to do this themselves. Here are some sort of key early priorities which I would recommend. The first of which is to scope what the purpose of the strategy is. So is it an adaptation strategy? Is it an adaptation plan with really specific actions identified? Is it an investment plan? To really understand early on what the strategy needs to include. Secondly, to engage staff. So very early on in the process, we engage staff working directly and indirectly in this space, and this was done through workshops, also direct meetings, and then that survey that I mentioned. Also to identify any data needs and data sources, allowing sufficient time to analyse that data, and also to conduct a literature review. And then just some additional considerations is really mapping internal and external engagement. Also considering what the broader council plans and strategies are and how the adaptation work kind of sits within that, and how it essentially why it's necessary. Why do you need a new strategy as opposed to the ones that already exist? And then just thinking about all the next steps. So in a way, writing the strategy is the easy bit, but actually implementing it is more complicated.